Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 2, focusing on Forces and Factors I, Ancient Jewish Monotheism as the Matrix of Early Christ Devotion, Larry W. Hurtado, Lord Jesus Christ, Devotion to Jesus in Earliest Christianity, Grand Rapids, William B. Geerdman's Publishing Company, 2003, Chapter 1. Welcome to our advanced seminar on New Testament Christology. Today, we delve into the foundational matrix of early Christ devotion, specifically focusing on the deconstruction of older scholarly paradigms and the assertion of ancient Jewish monotheism as the primary context. We begin with deconstructing Wilhelm Bousset's Son of Man hypothesis. Bousset's highly influential work posited that the earliest Palestinian Jewish Christians primarily confessed Jesus through the apocalyptic title Son of Man. However, as Larry W. Hurtado meticulously argues, this characterization is severely flawed. Let us consider a critical observation from the text. The very fact that the phrase the Son of Man was rigidly restricted to sayings attributed to Jesus and, conversely, absent from all New Testament statements about his significance suggests that, like Paul and John of Patmos, the Palestinian Christians did not find the phrase useful for talking about the meaning of Jesus for faith. This reveals a profound disconnect in Bousset's logic. If Son of Man were indeed the central confessional title of the earliest community, we would logically expect to find it saturated throughout their liturgical practices and confessional formulas. Instead, its primary function in the Gospels is as a self-designation by Jesus, and intriguingly, it never triggers the kind of violent objection or controversy provoked by titles like Messiah or Son of God. Furthermore, Hurtado notes, there is no indication that the Son of Man was used by early Christians as a confessional title that expressed this expectation. Instead, they preferred other Christological terms. For instance, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10, which is universally recognized as a very early confessional fragment, Jesus is awaited from heaven as God's Son, not the Son of Man. Therefore, we must decisively discard Bousset's simplistic restriction of early Jesus devotion to a future redemptive role encapsulated in a single apocalyptic title. In its place, we must recognize a much richer, wider role of Jesus in the religious beliefs and cultic practices of the earliest Palestinian and diaspora groups. Re-evaluating the Kyrios title in early devotion. We now move to Bousset's second major mischaracterization, concerning the title Kyrios, or Lord. Bousset famously argued that confessing Jesus as Lord represented a severe Hellenization of the Christian faith, insisting it was a title supposedly appropriated from pagan cults by Gentile Christians to accommodate their polytheistic backgrounds. Hurtado systematically dismantles this claim. Listen to this crucial finding from our primary text. Contra Bousset, the Kyrios title does not represent some major terminological or Christological innovation among Gentile Christians who supposedly appropriated the title from pagan cults. Instead, the term goes back to the devotional life of Jewish Christian circles. The historical and linguistic evidence for this is robust and multifaceted. First, Greek-speaking Jews in the diaspora had long used Kyrios as a reverent substitute for the Hebrew tetragrammaton, Yahweh, when reading biblical texts aloud in the synagogue. Thus, it was already a deeply indigenized, profoundly sacred part of their religious vocabulary. Furthermore, Hurtado points out, it is also clear that acclaiming and invoking Jesus as Lord was done in Aramaic-speaking Christian circles as well as in Greek-speaking ones, as indicated by the invocation formula, Maranatha, preserved by Paul in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 22. This Aramaic phrase, meaning our Lord, come, was so universally recognized and deeply embedded in early liturgy that Paul did not even need to translate it for his Greek-speaking Gentile congregation in Corinth. When we look closely at the Pauline epistles, the use of Kyrios frequently involves direct, deliberate allusions to Old Testament passages. This completely solidifies the conclusion that the early use of this title derived strictly from Jewish religious vocabulary, completely undermining and destroying Bousset's theory of a pagan mystery cult derivation. Reclaiming divine sonship from pagan contexts. The third pillar of Bousset's flawed theoretical framework involves the profound concept of divine sonship. Bousset boldly posited that Paul utilized this category merely as a clever marketing device. He argued that Paul borrowed from a pagan environment, where sons of the gods were literally venerated, specifically to justify the worship of Jesus to his new Gentile converts. Hurtado vigorously and successfully challenges this assumption. Here is what the text reveals about the true, historical origins of this concept. A careful analysis of the theme in Paul's epistles shows that his attribution of divine sonship to Jesus derives its meaning from biblical and Jewish traditions, in which divine sonship did not necessarily connote divinity. In the complex theology of the Second Temple period, this specific language was readily and frequently applied to the divinely chosen Davidic king, the persecuted righteous individual, or even the nation of Israel collectively. In these Jewish contexts, it denoted special divine favor, election, and relationship, absolutely not ontological equality with God in a pagan sense. Hurtado further clarifies Paul's specific usage of the term. Paul's references to Jesus' divine sonship all involve primarily connotations of God's direct involvement in Jesus, Jesus' special status with God, and Jesus' consequent honor and authority. It is highly telling and statistically significant that Paul's heaviest use of the phrase Son of God occurs in Romans and Galatians. These are the very letters where he most intimately and fiercely engages with Old Testament covenants and Jewish traditions. Moreover, in contexts reflecting actual, corporate worship, Paul almost exclusively relies on the title Kyrios, not Son of God. Therefore, the theme of Jesus' divine sonship in earliest Christianity was firmly, inextricably rooted in a Jewish conceptual matrix. It was absolutely not a pagan intrusion designed to connote the divine status of a human figure to a polytheistic audience. Dismantling the Palestinian and Hellenistic stratification. Having deconstructed Bousset's specific Christological claims, we must now address his broader historical framework. For generations, New Testament scholarship operated almost blindly on Bousset's model of sequential layering, proposing a primitive Palestinian Jewish stratum, followed by a Hellenistic Gentile stratum, and finally synthesizing into the Pauline theology. Hurtado argues that this paradigm is profoundly misleading and historically bankrupt. Let us examine the actual historical reality of the first century. It does not adequately allow for the clear interplay of influences characteristic of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Jews had encountered Hellenistic language and culture for 300 years by the time of Jesus. To imagine a pristine, isolated Palestinian Judaism completely untouched by Greek thought is a total historical fiction. All forms of Jewish culture in the Roman period, whether located in the heart of Judea or spread across the diaspora, were Hellenized to varying degrees. Building upon this foundational reality, Hurtado makes a critical point about the early Christian communities themselves. If it is now recognized as wrong to speak of a Palestinian Jewish setting free from Hellenistic influences, we should also realize that it is inaccurate to speak of a purely Hellenistic Gentile community prior to Paul. Even Paul's predominantly Gentile churches were heavily shaped, theology-directed, and led by Christian Jews. We must constantly remember that a scant 20 years separate the death of Jesus from Paul's earliest extant letters. These texts already reflect a highly developed, robust pattern of divine devotion to Jesus. This intense devotion likely predates Paul's own conversion and was precisely the theological offense that provoked his zealous persecution of the Jewish Christian movement. We must therefore abandon these neat, unilinear stages of development and recognize a much more dynamic, explosive emergence of Christ devotion within a complex, cosmopolitan Jewish matrix. Hurtado's methodological paradigm and chronological scope. With the severe inadequacies of the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule exposed, Larry W. Hurtado proposes a new, more robust methodological paradigm for understanding the emergence of Christ devotion. A key element of his approach is a deliberately expanded chronological scope. Listen carefully to his rationale for this expansion. I contend that extending the chronological sweep well into the 2nd century is important in giving us a better historical perspective for this earliest period. Moreover, it allows us to see better the possible effects upon Christ devotion as the Christian movement became dominantly made up of Gentiles. By tracing the historical trajectory down into the late 2nd century, we are able to witness the critical transition where Christianity begins to articulate its faith using categories drawn heavily from Greek intellectual traditions, eventually emerging as a distinct religion completely separate from Judaism. This broader field of vision beautifully captures both the historical continuity and the inevitable theological development. Furthermore, Hurtado emphasizes a crucial shift in focus regarding exactly what we should study. I agree with scholars such as Bossuet, Adolf Deisman, Johannes Weiss, and others of the early decades of the 20th century that the Christological beliefs of early Christians are best seen, and more profoundly understood as well, in the context of their piety and the patterns of their religious devotion. Rather than merely tracing the abstract evolution of Christological titles like a dry history of ideas, we must anchor our analysis deeply in the lived, liturgical reality of the early believers. How did they pray? How did they worship corporately? It is within these tangible, everyday acts of devotion that the true, unprecedented nature of their absolute reverence for Jesus is most vividly displayed and most accurately comprehended. Formulating a multi-factor historical model. Historical inquiry demands that we ask not merely what happened in the past, but how and why it happened. The emergence of devotion to Jesus as a divine figure alongside God is one of the most remarkable and paradigm-shifting phenomena in religious history, and it requires a sophisticated explanatory model. Hurtado intensely critiques previous generations of scholars for relying on overly simplistic explanations. As he notes in the text, a good many scholars have simply subscribed to the syncretism theory of the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule and have fitted their readings of the historical sources into this scheme. This outdated theory, which attributes the rise of Christ devotion simply to the gravitational pull of pagan polytheism, fundamentally fails to do justice to the strictly monotheistic Jewish roots of the early movement. It ignores the particularities of the actual historical data. To correct this academic blind spot, Hurtado advocates for a much more complex, layered approach. Whatever the adequacy of the set of factors I will discuss, the basic thrust of the theory is that we have to think in terms of multiple factors and not a simple explanation such as the syncretistic model of the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule. We cannot rely on a single historical magic bullet. We must posit a dynamic, interacting combination of historical forces. Historical understanding certainly relies on analogy, but we must be incredibly careful not to force false, pagan analogies upon the early Christian movement. We need a robust model that accounts for the explosive, multilinear, and sometimes highly unpredictable trajectory of early Christ devotion, recognizing that its unprecedented development was driven by a unique convergence of Jewish theological traditions, intense religious experiences, and specific socio-historical contexts. Ancient Jewish monotheism as the foundational matrix. We now turn to the absolute most critical contextual factor in our study, the absolute, unyielding monotheism of ancient Judaism. Christianity did not emerge in a theological vacuum, it erupted violently within the heavily guarded borders of Jewish religious tradition. As Hurtado emphatically states, what became Christianity began as a movement within the Jewish religious tradition of the Roman period, and the chief characteristic of Jewish religion in this period was its defiantly monotheistic stance. This was not always the case in ancient Israel. A genuinely exclusivist monotheism, which is the absolute denial of the reality or efficacy of any other deity, was fiercely crystallized during the trauma of the Babylonian exile, as seen profoundly in the prophecies of 2nd Isaiah. This theological anvil forged a religion uniquely resistant to syncretism. Moving into the Hellenistic and Roman periods, this stance hardened significantly. Hurtado explains the cultural dynamics at play. In the continuing experience of devout Jews in the religious environment of the ancient Near East in the Persian period and thereafter, an exclusivist monotheism became so fully identified with Jewish piety that by the Roman period failure to maintain such a stance was perhaps the greatest sin possible for a Jew. While Jews might readily adopt Greek language, dress, and civic customs, crossing the line into foreign worship was utterly unthinkable. It constituted the total abandonment of Judaism itself. Understanding this fierce exclusivity is absolutely paramount for our study. It means that the sudden inclusion of Jesus into the devotional life of early Jewish Christians was not a casual or natural evolution. It was a seismic, unprecedented shift that requires a profound historical and theological explanation, as it possessed no true parallel anywhere in the ancient Jewish world. Defending the monotheistic consensus against ditheistic claims. Recently, some scholars have attempted to soften the stark uniqueness of early Christ devotion by arguing that Roman-era Judaism already possessed a ditheistic, or two-God, theology. If this were true, the worship of Jesus would simply be a natural continuation of existing Jewish practices. We must critically examine these claims, focusing particularly on the highly controversial arguments of Peter Heyman and Margaret Barker. Hurtado finds their textual evidence severely lacking. Regarding Heyman's assertion of a functional Jewish belief in two gods, the text points out a fatal flaw. Neither is able to show an actual devotional pattern involving public and corporate worship offered to any figure other than the God of Israel in the extant sources that derive from and reflect the worship practices of Jewish groups of the period. While ancient Jewish literature is indeed filled with prominent angels and highly exalted patriarchs, and while some marginal texts might show evidence of private magical invocations, there was absolutely no corporate angel cultus. No synagogue gathered on the Sabbath to offer sacrifice or liturgical praise to the Archangel Michael or to Enoch. Hurtado further addresses Margaret Barker's theory that Jesus' worship reflects an ancient Israelite theology of two deities, Yahweh and Elyon. He states, she rightly identifies the crucial question as how it could have been possible for monotheistic Jews to have worshipped Jesus, but she answers it with a simplistic set of alternatives, a false dilemma. Barker wrongly assumes that Christ devotion must either be a pagan intrusion or a mere relabeling of authentic, ancient ditheistic Jewish traditions. She completely fails to consider the possibility of a radical, internal reconfiguration of strict monotheism driven by new, powerful religious experiences. The historical reality remains firm. Devout Roman-era Jews rigorously restricted cultic worship to the one God of Israel alone. Cultic worship versus venerative obeisance. The ongoing debate over Jewish monotheism often hinges heavily on exactly how we interpret ancient texts describing reverence given to exalted figures. The scholar Crispin Fletcher Lewis has controversially argued that early Judaism did indeed allow for the literal worship of divine humanity, citing instances where figures like the high priest are bowed down to by the crowds. To navigate this effectively, we must make a rigorous, non-negotiable distinction between cultural obeisance and true cultic worship. As Hurtado clarifies, the ancient world operated on a broad spectrum of reverence. In the ancient world of these texts, however, reverence was expected for, and rather freely given to, any superior person or being, whether human or heavenly, and obeisance was given to any victor in battle and by subject peoples to those who subdued them. The physical gesture of bowing down, often denoted by the Greek word proskenion, was utilized for honoring a king, greeting a wealthy patron, or worshipping a deity. The meaning depended entirely on the intended honor. Hurtado pinpoints the profound conceptual error in Fletcher Lewis's argument. Jews scrupulous about reserving worship for the true and living God refused to bow down to the images of Gentile gods, but nevertheless showed reverence and obeisance for other figures, e.g., for rulers and those in high office. Thus, observing a Jew bowing to a high priest in the temple courts or bowing to a king does not mean they viewed that human figure as an ontological deity alongside Yahweh. True cultic worship, which uniquely involves liturgical praise, sacrifice, and the specific intent to commune with absolute divinity, was jealously and violently guarded. Failing to distinguish between social veneration and actual cultic worship leads to a profound misreading of both ancient Judaism and the unique nature of early Christ devotion. Assessing the evidence, 1st Enoch and the life of Adam and Eve. Let us delve much deeper into the specific textual evidence used by scholars to argue for the worship of divine humanity in ancient Judaism. Crispin Fletcher Lewis points emphatically to passages in 1st Enoch, where all inhabitants of the earth fall down before the Son of Man, claiming this as evidence of actual cultic worship. Hurtado provides a critical, devastating corrective to this reading. Let us examine the proper textual context. Read in their contexts. The references in 1 Enoch 48:5, 62:1-9 to the obeisance given by all the inhabitants of the earth and by the mighty kings and rulers to the Son of Man/elect one simply envision the eschatological acknowledgement of this figure as God's appointed one. This obeisance is a direct literary fulfillment of the prophecies found in Isaiah, where foreign nations and former oppressors are forced by God to acknowledge the vindication of God's chosen servant. It is an act of total political and eschatological submission, not the ongoing liturgical worship of a second deity. Similarly, Fletcher Lewis cites the Latin version of the life of Adam and Eve, where God commands the heavenly angels to reverence the newly created Adam. Hurtado addresses the profound irrelevance of this text directly. As Fletcher Lewis acknowledges, there is no straightforward correlation with any form of contemporary Jewish praxis, but this is precisely what we need in order to have a real precedent for the worship of Jesus. A mythological, highly imaginative scene set in the primordial past, designed purely as an etiological tale to explain Satan's fall through his arrogant refusal to honor God's image, absolutely does not constitute evidence of actual, historical synagogue worship directed at a human figure. The early Christian devotion to Jesus was not a mythological trope, it was a lived, weekly, corporate reality that finds no true precedent whatsoever in these ancient Jewish texts. Monotheism as cultic practice versus doctrinal constraint. Finally, to conclude our seminar, we must forcefully critique scholars who view ancient Jewish monotheism merely as a rigid, inflexible doctrinal rule. Scholars like A. E. Harvey and Maurice Casey argue that this intellectual constraint made it absolutely impossible for Jewish Christians to consider Jesus divine, concluding that such devotion could only arise much later among Gentile converts who broke the rules. Hurtado exposes the severe limitations of this perspective. Let us consider his critique of Harvey. His references to Jewish monotheism solely as a constraint give the impression of a rather rigid doctrinal commitment that could not easily be broken, to use his image. He does not consider the possibility of a religious commitment such as monotheism being adapted and reformulated by adherents of a tradition. This deeply flawed view reduces a dynamic, lived faith into a static philosophical proposition. Monotheism was never merely a list of theological attributes distinguishing God from angels on a piece of parchment, it was primarily and fiercely expressed through exclusive liturgical practice. Hurtado emphasizes this critical distinction above all else. Like a good many other scholars, Harvey portrays Jewish monotheism, and early Christian developments too, in terms of doctrines and concepts, giving insufficient attention to the cultic/liturgical practices and scruples involved. The earliest Jewish believers did not abandon their ancestral monotheism, rather, they radically mutated it from within. Driven by profound, undeniable religious experiences of the risen Christ, they dynamically incorporated Jesus into their exclusive cultic worship of Yahweh, creating an unprecedented binitarian devotional pattern. This was not a Gentile paganization of Christianity, but a deeply Jewish theological explosion that redefined the boundaries of monotheistic worship forever. Welcome to our second week of the seminar. Today we delve deeply into Forces and Factors I, Ancient Jewish Monotheism as the Matrix of Early Christ Devotion. Our first major topic for this session is deconstructing the Hellenization hypothesis. Let us begin by examining a critical turning point in the historiography of early Christology. Larry Hurtado notes, Boussaint's characterization of the Christological views of his Hellenistic Christians and of Paul has also been shown to be badly off base. For a long time, the dominant paradigm in biblical scholarship, heavily influenced by Wilhelm Boussaint's monumental work, posited a strict evolutionary model. Boussaint argued passionately that early Christianity developed in neat, sequential layers, starting from a pure Palestinian Jewish community and progressively degenerating into a Hellenistic Gentile syncretism. According to this deeply entrenched view, the high Christology we see in the Apostle Paul was essentially a pagan infection, a Hellenization of the primitive faith designed to appeal to polytheistic converts. However, this neat categorization completely collapses under rigorous historical scrutiny. The ancient world was not so cleanly divided by invisible cultural borders. Jews had been deeply encountering Hellenistic culture, philosophy, and language for over 3 centuries by the time of Jesus of Nazareth. Therefore, positing a pristine Palestinian environment completely insulated from Hellenistic influence is a historical fiction. Furthermore, Hurtado argues, his sharp distinctions between the beliefs of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians in the first few decades of the 1st century were artificial and without foundation, and by all indications the cultic veneration of Jesus began both incredibly early and among groups made up largely of, and dominated by, Jewish Christians with profound loyalty to a monotheistic religious stance. This is the absolute crux of the matter. We are not looking at a gradual, centuries-long process of mythologization driven by pagan converts. Instead, we are observing an explosive, unprecedented mutation that occurred within the very heart of the Jewish Christian community. The cultic veneration of Jesus, which means treating him as a rightful recipient of divine honors, emerged startlingly early. It was not a Gentile compromise, but rather a profoundly Jewish phenomenon. These early believers did not abandon their ancestral monotheism, they dynamically reconfigured it to include Jesus. This realization forces us to discard the old history of religion's models and search for the actual forces and factors that catalyzed such a momentous theological shift within a strictly monotheistic matrix. Moving to our next critical point, we address the Jewish matrix of the Kyrios title. One of the central pillars of the old history of religion school was the origin of the title Lord, or in Greek, Kyrios. Let us look at what the text reveals. Hurtado clearly states, contra Bossuet, the Kyrios title does not represent some major terminological or Christological innovation among Gentile Christians who supposedly appropriated the title from pagan cults. Instead, the term goes back to the devotional life of Jewish Christian circles. Bossuet had theorized that when the Christian message moved out of Palestine and into the Greco-Roman world, Gentile converts felt the psychological and cultural need to elevate Jesus to the status of a cultic deity, akin to the gods of the mystery religions or the newly deified Roman emperors. Thus, they supposedly slapped the title Kyrios onto Jesus to make him competitive in the religious marketplace. But the historical evidence shatters this assumption entirely. The title Lord was not a pagan import, it was deeply indigenized within the religious vocabulary of Greek-speaking Jews. When Hellenistic Jews read the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, they pronounced the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, as Kyrios. Therefore, to call Jesus Kyrios was to invoke the most sacred language of Jewish devotion, not the language of pagan polytheism. Furthermore, Hurtado points out, it is also clear that acclaiming and invoking Jesus as Lord was done in Aramaic-speaking Christian circles as well as in Greek-speaking ones, as indicated by the invocation formula, Maranatha, preserved by Paul in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 22. Think about the massive historical significance of this single verse. The Apostle Paul, writing a letter to a Greek-speaking congregation in the cosmopolitan city of Corinth, utilizes an untranslated Aramaic phrase, Maranatha, which translates to Our Lord, come. This phrase was already so firmly established, so universally recognized as a fixed liturgical formula, that Paul did not even need to translate it for his Gentile audience. It proves conclusively that the practice of invoking Jesus as Lord originated in the earliest, Aramaic-speaking Jewish Christian communities in Palestine. When early believers adapted Old Testament passages originally speaking of Yahweh and applied them directly to Jesus, they were performing a radical, intra-Jewish theological maneuver, firmly anchored in scriptural exegesis, rather than borrowing concepts from pagan emperor worship. Next, we turn our attention to the context of divine sonship. How did early believers understand Jesus as the Son of God? Once again, we must dismantle past academic misconceptions. Hurtado explains, in Bossuet's view, the meaning of the references to Jesus' divine sonship was taken directly from the pagan religious environment where sons of the gods were themselves venerated as divine beings. It is somewhat easy to see how earlier scholars made this sweeping leap. The Greco-Roman world was absolutely filled with demigods, mythological heroes, and emperors who explicitly claimed to be literal sons of the gods. Bossuet essentially accused the Apostle Paul of using divine sonship as a clever marketing device, translating the core gospel message into a pagan idiom to make it palatable to Gentiles. However, this fundamentally misreads Paul's theology and the cultural matrix of the first century. Hurtado counters this by observing, a careful analysis of the theme in Paul's epistles shows that his attribution of divine sonship to Jesus derives its meaning from biblical and Jewish traditions, in which divine sonship did not necessarily connote divinity. In the rich tapestry of the Hebrew scriptures and Second Temple literature, being a son of God was not about Greek-style apotheosis or having a divine genetic makeup. It was a profoundly relational and vocational category. It was applied to the Davidic king, emphasizing his role as God's appointed vice-regent on earth. It was applied to the uniquely righteous individual who suffered for their strict obedience to the Torah. It was even applied to the entire nation of Israel as a whole, representing their covenantal intimacy with Yahweh. When Paul calls Jesus the Son of God, he is drawing on these profound, ancient Jewish reservoirs. It is utterly fascinating to note that Paul uses the phrase most frequently in Romans and Galatians. These are the very letters where he is most fiercely engaged in intense exegetically debates over the Old Testament and Jewish identity. If Son of God were merely a pagan concept, Paul would not have anchored it so deeply in his most Jewish arguments. Moreover, the title that most clearly designated Jesus as a recipient of actual cultic worship in early formulas was Kyrios, not Son of God. Therefore, the theme of divine sonship functions to highlight Jesus' supreme messianic vocation and his unique, unrepeatable relationship with the Father, completely bypassing the pagan mythology of deified humans. Now we must address vital matters of methodology and methodological expansion, scope and chronology. How do we properly study this massive historical phenomenon? Hurtado lays out his approach with a distinct and expansive vision. He notes, extending the chronological sweep well into the 2nd century is important in giving us a better historical perspective for this earliest period. While our primary historical fascination often lies strictly with the first few decades of the Christian movement, stopping the clock precisely at the end of the New Testament era deprives us of vital context. By carefully watching how Christ's devotion navigated the turbulent waters of the 2nd century, a critical period when Christianity was becoming predominantly Gentile and was forced to vigorously articulate its faith using Greek intellectual categories, we can retroactively illuminate the 1st century developments. The 2nd century provides a much larger canvas, showing how the tributaries of the 1st century flowed into the broader Orthodox and heterodox traditions. More importantly, Hurtado aligns himself with a crucial methodological insight from earlier scholars, stating, the Christological beliefs of early Christians are best seen, and more profoundly understood as well, in the context of their piety and the patterns of their religious devotion. True theology does not exist in an abstract vacuum, it is breathed out in intense prayer, sung in corporate hymns, and enacted in sacred rituals. To understand what the early Christians truly believed about Jesus, we must look at exactly how they worshipped him. Furthermore, we must permanently abandon the simplistic, 19th-century idea of a straight, unbroken line of doctrinal evolution. History is inherently messy. The development of Christology was not a neat, unilinear progression from low to high. Instead, we should actively think in terms of multilinear trajectories, parallel developments, and highly unexpected theological mutations. In fact, as Hurtado provocatively suggests, the emergence of Christ's devotion was less like an orderly, logical progression and much more like an explosion. It was a sudden, massive, and unparalleled outpouring of devotion to Jesus that radiated rapidly in multiple, complex directions from the very inception of the movement. This brings us to the absolute core of our investigation, the primary matrix, ancient Jewish monotheism. If we are to truly understand the unprecedented devotion given to Jesus, we must thoroughly understand the theological soil from which it sprang. Hurtado unequivocally declares, what became Christianity began as a movement within the Jewish religious tradition of the Roman period, and the chief characteristic of Jewish religion in this period was its defiantly monotheistic stance. This was not a soft, philosophical monotheism debated in academic halls, it was a fierce, exclusivist commitment forged in the brutal fires of historical trauma. The clearest, most defiant articulation of this absolute denial of other gods emerged during the Babylonian exile, particularly in the soaring, combative rhetoric of Isaiah chapters 43 through 48. Forced into the heartland of foreign deities, Israel's prophets did not capitulate, they boldly proclaimed that Yahweh alone was sovereign, and the majestic gods of the surrounding nations were nothing but lifeless wood and stone. This exilic experience crystallized an exclusivist posture that only intensified over the subsequent centuries. By the time of the Roman era, Hurtado emphasizes, for the vast majority, this was the final barrier that could not be crossed. To engage in the worship of other deities was to abandon Judaism. We often mistakenly picture ancient Jews as completely isolated and walled off from the world, but the reality is that many Jews in the Hellenistic period adopted Greek language, wore Greek clothing, participated enthusiastically in Greek sports, and utilized Greek intellectual categories. They were highly adaptable in many areas of secular culture. However, the exclusive worship of the one God of Israel was entirely non-negotiable. To offer cultic devotion to any other being was the ultimate betrayal of the covenant. It was this uncompromising, strictly policed monotheism that formed the absolute baseline for the earliest disciples of Jesus. They were not polytheists ready to carelessly add another deity to a crowded pantheon, they were devout Jews for whom the singularity of God was the foundational axiom of the universe. Building upon this unshakable foundation, we must look at monotheism in practice, the withholding of cultic worship. It is one thing to have a high theology of one God, it is quite another to see how that theology is rigidly embodied in daily and communal rituals. Hurtado points out a crucial, paradigm-shifting distinction: even the angelic figures that formed part of God's vast heavenly entourage, and also the great human heroes, were not treated as rightful recipients of cultic worship in any known Jewish circles of the time. We must remember that the ancient Jewish cosmos was not empty. It was heavily populated with magnificent, powerful angels, exalted patriarchs like Moses or Enoch, and powerful, personified divine attributes. These figures were highly revered and deeply respected. They functioned dynamically as God's divine agents, carrying out his sovereign will across the earth. Yet, there was a massive, impenetrable theological wall separating high reverence from actual cultic worship. Devout Jews fiercely and consistently withheld worship from these exalted figures. This definitively proves that their monotheism wasn't just ethnic xenophobia against foreign gods, it was an absolute, categorical restriction against worshipping even the greatest, most glorious members of their own heavenly home team. Hurtado defines this cultic worship precisely as devotion offered in a specifically worship, or liturgical, setting and expressive of the thanksgiving, praise, communion, and petition that directly represent, manifest, and reinforce the relationship of the worshippers with the deity. While Jews might poetically ask an angel to carry a desperate prayer to God, they did not gather corporately on the Sabbath to sing hymns of praise to the archangel Michael, nor did they offer incense or sacrifices to Moses. The absolute uniqueness of God was maintained fundamentally through the strict exclusivity of cultic practice. Consequently, Hurtado argues, the incorporation of Christ into the devotional pattern of early Christian groups has no real analogy in the Jewish tradition of the period. The historical fact that early Christians, who fully and deeply shared this monotheistic allergy to worshipping secondary figures, suddenly began offering corporate, liturgical worship to Jesus is a historical shockwave. It is a profound structural anomaly that demands a robust, unprecedented historical explanation, as there was simply no precedent for it in the Jewish matrix. Not all scholars agree with this assessment, which brings us to our rigorous critique of the ditheism hypothesis. Some revisionist historians have attempted to artificially soften the monotheistic nature of ancient Judaism in order to easily explain away the sudden rise of Christ devotion. For instance, Hurtado critically addresses the work of Margaret Barker, noting, Barker contends that the early Christian cultic reverence of Christ represented an adaptation of an alleged theology of two deities, from pre-exilic Israelite religion that somehow survived in Jewish circles of the Roman period. Barker and others, like Peter Heyman, argue that ancient Jewish religion actually harbored a hidden binitarian or ditheistic undercurrent, a lingering, suppressed belief in two gods, a high god and a subordinate creator deity, Yahweh. According to this speculative theory, the early Christians simply tapped into this ancient two-god theology and seamlessly mapped Jesus onto the second divine figure. Barker essentially presents us with a false, constrained dilemma: she assumes the early worship of Jesus must either be a complete pagan corruption or the natural continuation of a pre-existing, ditheistic Jewish theology. However, Hurtado identifies a massive, fatal empirical flaw in this entire approach. He meticulously observes, neither is able to show an actual devotional pattern involving public and corporate worship offered to any figure other than the God of Israel in the extant sources. It is entirely irrelevant to speculate endlessly about suppressed, pre-exilic Canaanite mythologies. What truly matters is the lived, empirical reality of the Roman era. And in the massive corpus of Jewish texts from the Hellenistic and Roman periods, there is absolutely zero evidence of any Jewish synagogue or distinct sect that ever gathered to offer public, corporate liturgy to a second deity. There was simply no established binitarian cultus patiently waiting in the wings for Jesus. Instead of reducing early Christianity to a mere relabeling of an old, discarded two-god myth, Hurtado proposes a much more dynamic, historically grounded model, a radical theological reconfiguration from within. The early Christians steadfastly maintained their strict monotheistic framework, but their explosive, unprecedented experiences with the risen Jesus forced them to dramatically expand the identity of the one God to include him. Let us deepen our scholarly critique by examining the semantics of reverence, engaging Fletcher Lewis. Recently, scholar Crispin Fletcher Lewis has mounted a vigorous, highly publicized challenge against the academic consensus of strict Jewish monotheism. As Hurtado carefully summarizes, Fletcher Lewis claims there is considerable evidence that ancient Jewish tradition actually accommodated the worship of a particular righteous humanity which in one way or another had become divine or angelomorphic. Fletcher Lewis points to various ancient Jewish texts where highly exalted human figures are shown receiving profound, physical reverence, and he hastily concludes that devout Jews were entirely comfortable worshipping deified humans alongside God. However, Hurtado identifies a profound conceptual error in this argument, rooted deeply in a failure to grasp ancient social semantics. Hurtado notes, the specific connotation of the prostration or other gestures depended entirely on what kind of honor the person offering the reverence intended to attribute to the figure receiving the gesture. In the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world, the physical act of bowing down, often translated from the Greek word proskenion, was a highly versatile, everyday gesture. It was not exclusively reserved for deities in a temple. A person would fall down in proskynesis before a conquering earthly king, a powerful magistrate, a wealthy patron, or even a highly respected parent. A devout Jew who would boldly choose to die rather than offer a single pinch of incense to a marble statue of Zeus would nevertheless bow deeply to a Roman governor out of pure political deference, or to a patriarch out of profound familial respect. Fletcher Lewis mistakenly lumps all these varied gestures of deep social respect into the singular theological category of divine worship. We cannot carelessly take every historical instance of bowing, obeisance, or honorific language as definitive evidence of cultic worship. To firmly establish a true historical precedent for the Christian worship of Jesus, we need clear, undeniable evidence of humans receiving the specific, liturgical, cultic devotion that Jews categorically reserved for the Creator alone. As we will see upon further textual inspection, such evidence simply does not exist. Let us now apply this semantic clarity by re-evaluating divine humanity texts, specifically focusing on the figures of the Son of Man and Adam. Fletcher Lewis relies heavily on a few specific proof texts to build his case for the historical worship of divine humans. First, he points to the apocalyptic book of 1 Enoch, where the kings and the mighty rulers of the earth dramatically fall down and give obeisance to the heavenly figure known as the Son of Man. Doesn't this conclusively prove a second divine figure was worshipped? Not at all. Hurtado explains that these dramatic scenes simply envision the eschatological acknowledgement of this figure as God's appointed one who will gather the elect and subdue the haughty kings and nations. This is a direct, deliberate literary echo of the prophet Isaiah, who promised that Israel's violent Gentile oppressors would one day come crawling and bowing down to the vindicated nation of Israel. To definitively prove this point, look at the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 9. Here, the resurrected Jesus boldly promises the persecuted Christians in the city of Philadelphia that he will make their religious enemies come and bow down, using the exact Greek word, proskenion, at the Christians' feet. Obviously, the text is not suggesting for a second that the ordinary church members of Philadelphia are to be worshipped as literal gods. It is a powerful cultural image of ultimate vindication and submission. Second, Fletcher Lewis points to a fascinating, obscure text in the Latin life of Adam and Eve, where God commands the angels in heaven to bow down and reverence the newly created Adam because he bears the image of God. Hurtado dismisses this entirely as evidence for cultic practice, noting it is only a literary scene set in the mythic past where heavenly beings are told to reverence Adam as God's image. This is clearly an ideological myth, an imaginative narrative meant to explain why Satan originally rebelled, out of intense jealousy because he haughtily refused to bow to a human creature. There is absolutely no historical evidence that any Jewish community in the 1st century actually gathered in a synagogue to offer prayers and hymns to the primal Adam. A literary flourish embedded in a mythic narrative is simply not a blueprint for actual cultic liturgy. Continuing our rigorous textual scrutiny, we shift our focus to re-evaluating divine humanity texts, the High Priest. Fletcher Lewis also boldly attempts to leverage historical descriptions of the Jewish high priest to argue for human deification in ancient Judaism. He cites a text attributed to Hecataeus of Abdera which vibrantly describes Jewish crowds falling to the ground when the high priest publicly expounds the law. But as Hurtado rightly counters, it is a religious ceremony taking place in a religious site, and the high priest is given proper reverence there because that is where he exercises his religious role on behalf of the people. Bowing to the high priest during the sacred, terrifying liturgy of the temple was an act of profound respect for the divine office and for God himself, not an act attributing ontological divinity to the frail mortal man wearing the sacred robes. Similarly, Fletcher Lewis heavily invokes the famous, likely legendary, account recorded by Josephus, where Alexander the Great supposedly bows down in the dirt before the Jewish high priest. What is actually happening here? Hurtado explains that Alexander is astutely showing reverence for the appointed priest of the god of a conquered people to whom he wished to present himself positively. It was standard, calculated political theater for ancient conquerors to pay public homage to local cults to ensure peace and compliance. More importantly, Josephus explicitly states in the text that the Jews understood Alexander's bow as an act of worship directed strictly toward Yahweh, not toward the high priest himself. Finally, Fletcher Lewis aggressively points to the lavish, highly poetic praise of the high priest Simon in the book of Sirach, chapter 50, where Simon is breathtakingly compared to the morning star and the radiant rainbow. Hurtado remarks that while this is an undeniably beautiful panegyric, neither at the literary level nor in actual temple practice do we have any basis for Fletcher Lewis's attempt to portray Simon as worshipped as a divine being. Using soaring poetic similes to describe the glorious visual appearance of a priest executing his sacred duties is vastly, fundamentally different from offering him cultic sacrifice or liturgical prayer. Thus, all alleged historical precedents for the worship of divine humanity in Second Temple Judaism rapidly dissolve under careful historical analysis. The Jewish monotheistic boundary remained entirely unbreached. Now we must confront a completely different kind of historical error in monotheism as more than a doctrinal constraint. While some scholars desperately try to prove that Judaism wasn't strictly monotheistic, others make the exact opposite mistake. They treat monotheism as such a brittle, rigid philosophical straitjacket that they conclude early Jewish Christians could never have possibly worshipped Jesus. A prime academic example of this is the scholar A. E. Harvey. According to Harvey, the monotheistic commitment of early Jewish believers functioned as an impenetrable, absolute intellectual barrier. He argues that it was absolutely, psychologically impossible for a first-century Jewish Christian to conceive of Jesus as divine. Therefore, Harvey claims, it was not until Christianity had completely broken free from its Jewish roots and entered the wider Gentile world of the late 1st and early 2nd century, specifically pointing to figures like Ignatius of Antioch, that Jesus was finally, unambiguously hailed as a deity. Hurtado strongly and meticulously critiques this paradigm. He notes that Harvey portrays monotheism solely as a fixed creedal constraint that could only be either strictly enforced or totally, violently broken. Hurtado argues, he does not consider the possibility of a religious commitment such as monotheism being adapted and reformulated by adherents of a tradition so as to take account of their own religious experiences. We must remember that religious traditions are not fragile glass statues that simply shatter into pieces when struck by a new idea. They are dynamic, living, breathing organisms. The earliest Jewish Christians experienced profound, cataclysmic events, the resurrection of Jesus and the massive outpouring of the Holy Spirit. These explosive, undeniable experiences forced them to go back to their sacred scriptures and fundamentally rewire their understanding of God's internal life, without abandoning their core monotheism. Furthermore, Harvey makes the critical error of treating monotheism purely as an abstract, doctrinal concept, a matter of dry intellectual taxonomy. He completely fails to realize that for the ancient Jew, monotheism was primarily defined by cultic practice. The absolute boundary between the Creator and the created was drawn not merely in theological treatises, but in the living liturgy, in the singing of hymns, and in the visceral offering of prayers. Similar to Harvey, we see another deeply flawed application of this logic in monotheism, Gentile influence, and cultic practice, as clearly seen in the prominent work of Maurice Casey. In his book, From Jewish Prophet to Gentile God, Casey also uses a rigid definition of Jewish monotheism as a historical wedge. He asserts that as long as the Jesus movement was controlled by Jews, the monotheistic barrier held completely firm, and Jesus was viewed merely as an exalted human prophet. However, Casey theorizes that after the catastrophic destruction of the temple in 70 CE, as the Johannine community became heavily flooded with pagan Gentile converts, the monotheistic restraint finally snapped under the pressure. Under this pagan influence, Casey argues, the Gospel of John was written, and Jesus was suddenly, boldly declared to be God, essentially acting as a second deity alongside the Father. Hurtado fundamentally dismantles Casey's entire historical reconstruction. First, Casey makes a fatal methodological error. He uses his own rigid, modern definition of monotheism to absolutely predetermine what the early Christians could or could not have believed, forcefully shoving the historical data into his preconceived sociological mold. Furthermore, Casey relies on a massive, highly prejudiced assumption. He assumes that Gentile converts were completely apathetic about monotheism and were naturally eager to deify a human being. This ignores a vast, undeniable body of historical evidence. If we actually read the Gentile Christian apologists of the 2nd century, such as Justin Martyr or Athenagoras, we see that they were fiercely, aggressively dedicated to defending strict monotheism against the rampant polytheism of the Roman world. Gentile believers did not rapidly dilute Christian monotheism, they often championed it at the cost of their lives. Finally, exactly like Harvey, Casey operates almost entirely in the abstract realm of concepts and Christological titles, failing entirely to grasp the profound gravitational pull of actual devotional life. As Hurtado repeatedly emphasizes, it is in the tangible, bodily practices of corporate worship, the prayers, the sacraments, the invocation of the name, that the true Christological revolution actually occurred. The shift was not just a clever change in doctrinal vocabulary, it was a seismic, unprecedented transformation of the Jewish cultic landscape. This leads us directly to our final, synthesizing conclusion for this session, the uniqueness of early Christ devotion. Having systematically cleared away a century of flawed academic paradigms, whether it is the Hellenization theory of Bossuet, the ditheism hypothesis of Barker, the divine humanity theories of Fletcher Lewis, or the excessively rigid doctrinal constraints proposed by Harvey and Casey, we are finally left face to face with a profound historical mystery. Hurtado definitively concludes that the incorporation of Christ into the devotional pattern of early Christian groups was a most unusual and significant step that cannot be easily accounted for on the basis of any tendencies in Roman-era Jewish religion. The early Christians simply did not borrow their worship of Jesus from pagan mystery cults, nor did they opportunistically dust off a forgotten, heretical Jewish tradition of worshipping angels or patriarchs. What we are witnessing in the first 2 decades of the Christian movement is a completely unprecedented, unparalleled religious mutation. The earliest followers of Jesus, who were Aramaic-speaking, strictly Torah-observant, fiercely monotheistic Jews, suddenly and universally began to offer cultic, liturgical worship to a recently crucified and resurrected man. They radically reconfigured the very shape of their ancestral monotheism to accommodate Jesus squarely on the divine side of the line, viewing him not as a competitor to Yahweh, but as the unique and unrepeatable expression of the one true God. Remember, these were people from a religious culture so passionately devoted to the absolute singularity of God that they were routinely willing to endure brutal public mockery, physical torture, and horrific martyrdom rather than offer a single act of worship to a Roman emperor or a beautifully carved Greek statue. For such fiercely loyal people to spontaneously begin singing sacred hymns to Jesus, praying directly to him, and invoking his name in solemn rituals, requires historical catalysts of unimaginable, earth-shattering power. Therefore, as we proceed through the rest of this intensive course, we will not settle for easy, simplistic, or reductionist explanations. Instead, we must dig deeper to uncover the dynamic, explosive combination of historical forces, visionary experiences, and intense scriptural exegesis that miraculously drove these devout monotheists to recognize Jesus of Nazareth as the Lord of Glory. Conclusion Part 1: Dismantling the Hellenistic Paradigm and the Collapse of Bousset's Hypothesis. Welcome to the concluding application of our seminar. We have spent significant time analyzing the historical data, and now we must synthesize these findings to understand the true matrix of early Christ devotion. To do this properly, we have to clear away the debris of outdated scholarship. For much of the 20th century, the academic study of the New Testament was heavily influenced by a scholar named Wilhelm Bousset and his famous book Kyrios Christos. Bousset presented a very neat, almost evolutionary tale. He argued that the earliest Jewish followers of Jesus in Palestine merely thought of him as the apocalyptic Son of Man who would return in the future. According to Bousset, it was only when the Christian message spread out into the wider Greco-Roman world, the Hellenistic world, that Gentiles, who were used to worshipping many gods and emperors, started calling Jesus Lord, or Kyrios, and treating him as a divine figure. It was a theory of pagan contamination. But as we draw our conclusions today, we must completely discard this framework. Let us consider the words of our primary text. Bousset operated with a distinction between Palestinian and Hellenistic that, though widely accepted then and in many subsequent studies, has been shown to be simplistic. This is a profound methodological starting point for our application. You see, the idea that there was a pure, isolated Jewish culture in Palestine completely untouched by Greek language or thought is an illusion. It is like trying to imagine a modern European city completely untouched by American pop culture or the internet. It simply did not exist. By the time Jesus walked the shores of Galilee, the Jewish people had been living under the shadow of Greek culture for 3 centuries, ever since the conquests of Alexander the Great. Greek language, Greek architectural styles, and Greek administrative structures were deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life in Judea and Galilee. Therefore, trying to neatly separate early Christianity into a primitive Jewish phase and a later, corrupted Hellenistic phase is historically inaccurate. Let us look at the text again. Jews had encountered Hellenistic language and culture for 300 years by the time of Jesus, and all forms of Jewish culture of the Roman period were Hellenized in varying degrees and ways. What does this mean for our understanding of Christ's devotion? It means that the high view of Jesus, the worship of Jesus, did not require a demographic shift from Jewish to Gentile populations. The historical evidence strongly indicates that the intense, cultic veneration of Jesus began almost immediately, within the very first years after his crucifixion, and it began precisely among Jewish believers. These were men and women who recited the Shema daily, who fiercely believed that the Lord our God is one, and yet, they were the ones who first began to sing hymns to Christ, pray to him, and call upon his name for salvation. Bousset's grand theory failed because it underestimated the complexity of first-century Judaism and underestimated the explosive, unparalleled nature of what happened among the earliest Jewish Christians. As scholars, your application of this historical reality must shape how you read every Pauline epistle and every early Christian fragment. We are not looking at a slow, gradual paganization of a simple Jewish sect. We are witnessing an unprecedented religious mutation from within the heart of strict Jewish monotheism itself. This forces us to ask far more difficult and fascinating questions about the true origins of our faith. Conclusion Part 2: The Linguistic Proof of Jewish Devotion, Kyrios and Maranatha. Now we move to a crucial piece of linguistic evidence that cements our conclusion regarding the Jewish origins of Christ's devotion. If Wilhelm Bucer was wrong, and the title Lord, or Kyrios in Greek, did not come from pagan mystery cults or the worship of Roman emperors, where did it come from? How did it become the central confession of the early church? The answer lies in the linguistic habits of the Jewish people themselves. Long before Christianity emerged, Jews who lived outside of Palestine and spoke Greek had translated their Hebrew scriptures into what we call the Septuagint. When they came across the sacred, unpronounceable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, they needed a spoken substitute. Listen carefully to the text. Kyrios was used by Greek-speaking Jews for the Hebrew Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, when reading aloud the biblical texts, and so it had long been indigenized as part of the religious vocabulary available to Greek-speaking Christian Jews. This is a monumental point for our application. When the earliest Greek-speaking Jewish Christians began to call Jesus Kyrios, they were not reaching out into the pagan marketplace of ideas to find a term of honor. They were reaching deep into their own sacred scriptures. They were taking the very word used to designate the God of Israel and applying it to the crucified and risen Jesus. But the evidence goes even deeper, reaching past the Greek language right into the native tongue of Jesus himself, Aramaic. One of the most fascinating artifacts in the entire New Testament is found at the very end of the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Writing to a church of Gentile converts in a Greek city, Paul suddenly uses an untranslated Aramaic phrase, Maranatha. This translates to, Our Lord, come. As the text states, this Aramaic formula was so familiar already by the date of this epistle that no translation of it was required for his Greek-speaking Gentile Christian readers in Corinth. Let us pause and think about the historical weight of this single word. For a Greek-speaking congregation in Corinth to be casually using an Aramaic prayer formula, that formula must have originated at the very dawn of the Christian movement in Aramaic-speaking Palestine, specifically in Jerusalem or Galilee. It means that the earliest, original disciples of Jesus were crying out to him in prayer, addressing him as their Lord, and begging for his eschatological return. This completely shatters the idea that a high Christology took decades to evolve. It shows that within a few short years, perhaps even months, of the resurrection, Jewish believers were incorporating Jesus into their devotional life using the highest possible language of lordship. When you apply this to your own academic research, you must recognize that the linguistic trajectory of the New Testament does not move from a low human view of Jesus to a high divine view. It starts astonishingly high, rooted in the Aramaic prayers of the earliest Jewish community. Conclusion Part 3, Reclaiming Divine Sonship from the Pagan Environment. Having established the Jewish origins of the title Lord, we must now apply this same rigorous historical correction to the title Son of God. In the pagan environment of the Roman Empire, the phrase son of a god was quite common. It was used to describe mythological heroes like Hercules, or rulers like Augustus Caesar, who were seen as human beings elevated to the realm of the gods. Scholars of the past assumed that the Apostle Paul simply borrowed this pagan concept to make Jesus more appealing to his Gentile audiences. They essentially accused Paul of a clever marketing ploy, translating the Jewish Messiah into a Greek demigod so the pagans would worship him. But a careful historical analysis completely overturns this assumption. Let us examine the text together. A careful analysis of the theme in Paul's epistles shows that his attribution of divine sonship to Jesus derives its meaning from biblical and Jewish traditions, in which divine sonship did not necessarily connote divinity. In these traditions divine sonship language was applied to the divinely chosen king, the devout, righteous individual, and to Israel collectively. This is a vital distinction for our concluding application. When a Jewish person in the first century heard the term Son of God, they did not think of a biological offspring of a deity like Zeus. They thought of the Old Testament. They thought of the book of Exodus, where God calls the nation of Israel his firstborn son. They thought of Psalm 2, where the anointed king of David's line is declared to be God's son, representing God's righteous rule on earth. Divine sonship in the Jewish matrix was about an intimate relationship, divine election, supreme obedience, and carrying out the Father's will. It was not a statement of biological descent or pagan apotheosis. The text provides a brilliant piece of literary evidence for this. The biblical and Jewish associations of the language of divine sonship in Paul are further indicated by the fact that references to Jesus as God's Son are heavily concentrated in Romans and Galatians, the two epistles in which Paul makes the most detailed presentation of his message in connection with the Old Testament and Jewish traditions. Think about the profound logic of this. If Paul were using the title Son of God as a pagan marketing tool, we would expect him to use it constantly when writing to completely pagan churches, trying to connect with their background. But instead, he uses it most frequently precisely when he is engaged in deep, rigorous debates about the Jewish law, the covenant of Abraham, and the promises made to David. Furthermore, it is a historical fact that the early church rarely used the phrase Son of God in their actual hymns and worship formulas. When they gathered to sing and pray, the title they used most frequently was Kyrios, Lord. Therefore, as we finalize our understanding of early Christology, we must decisively strip away the pagan overlay that modern scholars have tried to impose on the New Testament. The early Christians were not importing Greek myths, they were exporting a radically fulfilled Jewish theology. Conclusion Part 4: The necessity of a multi-factor historical model. As we shift from critiquing past scholarship to building a solid framework for our own research, we must address the philosophy of historical methodology. How do historians figure out why something unprecedented happened? Unlike physicists or chemists, historians cannot put the first century into a laboratory test tube, recreate the conditions, and watch Christianity emerge again. We cannot run controlled experiments. Instead, we have to look for analogies. We look at other historical movements and try to identify common forces and factors. But what happens when you encounter an historical event that is entirely unique? The sudden, explosive emergence of cultic devotion to a crucified man within the confines of strict Judaism is precisely such an event. It has no perfect historical analogy. Therefore, simple, single-cause explanations will always fail. As our text argues, whatever the adequacy of the set of factors I will discuss, the basic thrust of the theory is that we have to think in terms of multiple factors and not a simple explanation such as the syncretistic model. When scholars in the past tried to explain early Christology simply by pointing to pagan syncretism, the blending of religions, they were using a monocausal explanation. They wanted a simple answer. But history is rarely simple. We need a dynamic theory, a multi-factor model. Think of it like a chemical reaction. You need a specific environment, you need a catalyst, and you need raw materials. In our historical model, the raw materials were the life and teachings of Jesus. The catalyst, as we will explore in later studies, involved the profound religious experiences of the earliest disciples, specifically their encounters with the risen Christ. But the environment, the absolute, non-negotiable matrix in which this explosion took place, was ancient Jewish monotheism. Listen to the warning in the text. Inaccurate observations and misguided comparisons produce theories that attribute too much significance to this or that and overlook other vital factors. If we ignore the fiercely monotheistic context of the first century, we will completely misread the data. We will fail to grasp how shocking, how culturally dangerous, and how theologically profound it was for Jewish believers to bow their knees to Jesus. As you apply this methodology to your own academic writing, remember to resist the temptation of simple explanations. Embrace the complexity of historical forces. We must understand how the uncompromising belief in one God interacted dynamically with the overwhelming conviction that this one God had exalted Jesus of Nazareth to his right hand. Conclusion Part 5: The Crucible of Exile and Exclusivist Monotheism. To fully appreciate the radical nature of early Christ devotion, we must plunge deeply into the historical soul of first-century Judaism. We must understand what monotheism really meant to them. It was not merely a philosophical concept discussed in academic halls, it was a matter of national survival, forged in the fires of historical trauma. The ancient religion of Israel had long struggled with idolatry, but true, exclusivist monotheism, the absolute denial that any other gods even exist, crystallized during their darkest hour. Our text brings this to light. The earliest and clearest expressions of a genuinely monotheistic belief, that is, a denial of the efficacy or reality of any other deity, are found in Isaiah 43-48, from the period of the Babylonian exile, in the forcible encounter with the many gods of other nations. Imagine the scene. The Israelites had lost their temple, their capital city, and their land. They were dragged as captives into the heart of the Babylonian Empire, surrounded by massive ziggurats and towering statues of Marduk and other pagan deities. It was precisely on the home turf of these foreign gods that the Jewish prophets boldly declared that the idols of the nations were nothing but wood and stone, and that Yahweh alone was the sovereign creator of the universe. This pugnacious monotheism became the bedrock of Jewish identity. Fast forward to the 2nd century BC, the time of the Maccabees. The Syrian Greek king, Antiochus IV, attempted to force the Jewish people to assimilate fully into Greek culture by setting up an altar to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple and slaughtering pigs on it. The resulting trauma and bloody revolt hardwired a profound resistance into the Jewish psyche. They would die before they compromised the uniqueness of their God. Listen to the stark reality described in our text. There could be no negotiating away the monotheistic posture of Jewish religion. As Lester Grabbe put it, for the vast majority, this was the final barrier that could not be crossed. Jews in the Roman era were actually quite flexible in many areas. They wore Greek clothing, spoke Greek, used Greek civic structures, and even engaged in Greek philosophy. But the altar was the uncrossable boundary. To offer a sacrifice, to sing a hymn of divine praise, to bow in ultimate submission to anyone other than the God of Israel was tantamount to apostasy. It meant you were no longer a Jew. This is the critical application for our study. If worshipping a second figure was the ultimate sin, the final barrier, how do we explain the fact that tens of thousands of devout Jews in the 1st century began offering cultic worship to Jesus of Nazareth, while still fiercely claiming to be faithful to the God of Abraham? The inclusion of Jesus into the devotional life of the early church is an historical earthquake, and recognizing the strength of the monotheistic barrier is the only way to measure its magnitude. Conclusion Part 6, Cultic Worship as the Ultimate Boundary Marker. As we deepen our application of historical methodology, we must address a very common point of confusion in modern scholarship. When you read ancient Jewish literature from the period of the Second Temple, you will find descriptions of heavenly angels, like Michael or Gabriel, and ancient patriarchs, like Moses or Enoch, written in incredibly exalted language. Sometimes, these figures are described with attributes so glorious that they sound almost divine. Because of this, some modern readers have mistakenly assumed that Jewish monotheism was soft, that the boundaries between God and the angels were blurry. But this is a severe misreading of the evidence. We must distinguish between rhetoric and ritual. We must distinguish between talking highly of a heavenly servant and actually offering them cultic worship. Listen to the crucial distinction made in our text. This withholding of cultic worship from these highly revered agents of God, whether angelic or human, is important. It shows that the ancient Jewish concern about the uniqueness of God was a genuinely exclusivist monotheism and not simply a negative attitude toward the deities of foreigners. This is absolutely brilliant. You see, the Jewish refusal to worship others was not just xenophobia, it wasn't just a rejection of Greek and Roman gods. It was an internal boundary as well. The Jews refused to worship the members of their own home team. Even the highest archangel, standing in the very presence of God, was never offered a sacrifice. They were never sung to in the temple liturgy. They were never the recipients of corporate prayer. Worship was the acid test of divinity. Let us clarify what we mean by this word. Because the word worship and its Greek and Hebrew equivalents can connote a variety of degrees and forms of reverence, by worship here I mean the sort of reverence that was reserved by ancient devout Jews for God alone, intended to indicate God's uniqueness. In the ancient world, you might bow down to a king out of respect, or prostrate yourself before a wealthy patron to beg for a favor. But cultic devotion, the liturgical gathering of the community to offer praise, thanksgiving, and absolute spiritual submission, was a totally different category of action. It was the boundary marker. Therefore, when we look at the early Christian communities and see them offering this specific, restricted category of cultic worship to Jesus, we are not looking at a slight elevation in honor. We are looking at a paradigm shift. They took the unique boundary marker that separated God from all creation, and they placed Jesus on the divine side of that line. Understanding the strictness of this liturgical boundary is essential for recognizing the explosive originality of early Christology. Conclusion Part 7, Refuting the Ditheistic Hypothesis. In the academic world, when a phenomenon is as startling and historically difficult to explain as the early worship of Jesus, scholars will inevitably propose radical theories to make it seem less surprising. In our application today, we must address and refute a specific trend in recent scholarship that attempts to dilute the strength of ancient Jewish monotheism. Scholars like Peter Heyman and Margaret Barker have proposed what we might call the ditheistic hypothesis. Heyman argues that Judaism never really abandoned its ancient Canaanite roots and functionally believed in two gods. Margaret Barker goes even further, claiming that ancient Israelites worshipped a high god called Elyon and a lesser god called Yahweh, and that this two-god theology survived secretly for centuries, eventually being used by early Christians who identified God the Father as Elyon and Jesus as Yahweh. By doing this, Barker tries to give the worship of Jesus a venerable, ancient pedigree. But these theories collapse under rigorous historical scrutiny. Let us consult the evidence as evaluated in our text. Neither is able to show an actual devotional pattern involving public and corporate worship offered to any figure other than the God of Israel in the extant sources that derive from and reflect the worship practices of Jewish groups of the period. This is the fatal flaw in their arguments. We can analyze ancient texts, poetry, and mystical literature all day long, but if we cannot find a single synagogue, a single community, or a single liturgical text from the Roman era where Jews gathered to publicly worship a second deity, the theory holds no water. Margaret Barker's entire argument rests on a logical fallacy, a false dilemma. She assumes there are only two possibilities: either the worship of Jesus was a complete pagan corruption, or it was just a relabeling of a secret, pre-existing Jewish religion of two gods. But our text offers the correct historical reality. The real answer is the reconfiguring of Jewish monotheistic practice and thought to accommodate Jesus with God as rightful recipient of worship under the impact of a set of factors and forces. Do you see the profound difference here? Early Christianity was not a pagan corruption, nor was it the resurrection of an ancient polytheistic cult. It was a completely new, dynamic reconfiguration of strict monotheism. The early Christians did not abandon the belief in one God. They expanded the identity of that one God to include the crucified and risen Christ. As researchers, you must be wary of theories that try to explain away the radical novelty of the Christian movement by projecting binitarian ideas back into an era of Judaism where they simply did not exist in cultic practice. Conclusion Part 8, The Problem of Venerative Language, Angels, and Magic. Now we must deal with the counter-evidence. Good historical application requires us to look at the data that seems to contradict our thesis. If ancient Judaism was so strictly monotheistic in its worship, how do we explain the fascination with angels in the Second Temple period? We find ancient Jewish magical papyri where people invoke the names of angels to cure diseases or cast curses. Furthermore, we find texts from the later Jewish rabbis specifically commanding people not to worship angels. Doesn't this suggest that some Jews were, in fact, worshipping angels, and perhaps the worship of Jesus evolved out of an angel cult? Once again, careful distinction is required. We must differentiate between private, superstitious folk magic and public, corporate cultic devotion. The world of ancient magic was a pragmatic one. People would invoke any spiritual name, Greek, Egyptian, or Jewish, if they thought it would give them power. But this was underground, unsanctioned behavior, entirely distinct from the liturgical life of the community. As for the literature that exalts angels, our text relies on the exhaustive research of scholars like Lorenz Stuckenbruck to clarify the issue. The venerative language used by ancient Jews about angels and even the occasional appeals to angels for assistance did not amount to cultic worship of angels, and the incorporation of angels into their view of God's sovereignty was apparently seen by devout Jews as compatible with their monotheistic commitment. What does this mean? It means that a devout Jew could believe that the archangel Michael commanded the armies of heaven, and that Gabriel delivered the messages of God, and they could speak of these beings with immense reverence, without ever feeling that they were compromising their monotheism. They saw the angels as a reflection of God's royal majesty, much like the glorious attendants of an earthly king. But they never built an altar to Michael. They never sang hymns to Gabriel on the Sabbath. There was no angel cultus. So why did the later rabbis write laws forbidding the worship of angels? The text provides the historical context. These prohibitions likely reflect historical developments in ancient Judaism in the 2nd century CE and later, involving rabbinic authorities taking a more negative view of the way angels had figured in Jewish religious thought. The rabbis were reacting. After the destruction of the temple, and faced with the rise of the Christian movement, which elevated a human being to the right hand of God, the rabbis built a theological fence around the community. They cracked down on the loose, venerative language of the past to ensure no one blurred the lines. Therefore, the veneration of angels provides no true precedent or analogy for the explosive, public, cultic worship that the early Christians offered to Jesus Christ. Conclusion Part 9, The Myth of Worshipped Humanity. As we continue to defend our methodological synthesis, we must address one more modern scholar who has attempted to find a Jewish precedent for the worship of Jesus. Crispin Fletcher Lewis has recently argued that Jewish tradition did, in fact, allow for the worship of human beings who had become divine or angelic. To support his claim, he points to Jewish apocalyptic literature. For example, in the book of 1st Enoch, there is a vision of the end of the world where kings and rulers bow down before a heavenly figure called the Son of Man. He also points to a document called the Life of Adam and Eve, which contains a story where God commands all the angels to bow down and reverence the newly created Adam. Fletcher Lewis points to these texts and says, "Look, here is proof that Jews worshipped other humans." But his argument suffers from a massive conceptual flaw. He fundamentally misunderstands the cultural vocabulary of the ancient Near East. Listen to our text's critique. In the ancient world of these texts, reverence was expected for, and rather freely given to, any superior person or being. But the specific connotation of the prostration or other gestures depended entirely on what kind of honor the person offering the reverence intended to attribute to the figure receiving the gesture. The Greek word for this physical act of bowing down is proskenion. If a peasant fell on his face before the Roman emperor, or a defeated general bowed before the conquering king, they were performing proskenion. But they were not offering cultic, religious worship, they were showing extreme political submission and respect. When the kings of the earth bow before the Son of Man in the book of Enoch, they are not worshipping him as God, they are acknowledging his God-given authority as the ultimate judge, fulfilling ancient prophecies from the book of Isaiah which promised that Israel's oppressors would one day bow at their feet. And what about the story of the angels bowing to Adam? As our text points out, this is a literary myth. It is a creative, imaginative story meant to explain the origins of evil, specifically, that Satan became evil because he arrogantly refused God's command to respect humanity. As the text states, there is no straightforward correlation with any form of contemporary Jewish praxis. We cannot build a historical theory on fictional, ideological tales. The early Christian devotion to Jesus was not a literary myth, it was a daily, lived reality where real people gathered in real rooms, broke bread, sang hymns, and offered prayers to Jesus as the co-recipient of divine honor alongside God the Father. There is absolutely no precedent for this in the literary texts regarding Enoch or Adam. Conclusion Part 10, Cultic Practice over Doctrinal Constraint. We have reached the final phase of our application, and we must conclude by fundamentally redefining how we study ancient theology. Many modern scholars, sitting in their library surrounded by textbooks, tend to think of religion primarily as a set of intellectual ideas or philosophical doctrines. Scholars like A. E. Harvey and Maurice Casey have written influential books arguing that Jewish monotheism was a rigid doctrinal constraint. They argue that this strict intellectual rule made it absolutely impossible for a Jewish Christian to ever think of Jesus as divine. Therefore, they conclude, the idea of Christ's divinity must have developed decades later, only after the religion was taken over by Gentiles who didn't care about this strict Jewish doctrine. But this approach represents a profound misunderstanding of how ancient religion actually worked. Let us examine the final critique in our text. Like a good many other scholars, Harvey portrays Jewish monotheism in terms of doctrines and concepts, giving insufficient attention to the cultic and liturgical practices and scruples involved. But these are the matters emphasized in ancient Jewish tradition as the key boundary markers. This is the ultimate takeaway of our seminar. First-century Jews did not define their religion by writing systematic theology textbooks. They defined their religion by what they did. They defined it by their liturgy, by their prayers, by their refusal to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and by their absolute dedication to offering cultic worship only to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The boundary of monotheism was drawn in the soil of daily ritual and temple practice, not just in the clouds of philosophical concepts. Therefore, the emergence of early Christ devotion was not a slow, philosophical debate that gradually broke the rules of monotheism. It was an immediate, explosive mutation in liturgical practice. The earliest Jewish believers, overwhelmed by their encounters with the resurrected Jesus and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, found themselves compelled to sing to Jesus, pray to Jesus, and ritually invoke his name for salvation. They did not abandon their monotheism, they radically reconfigured it. They brought Jesus inside the exclusive boundary of divine identity, creating a unique, binitarian shape to their worship. This is the magnificent, historically unparalleled reality of early Christianity. It forces us as scholars to recognize that the deepest theological truths are often forged not in the library, but in the sanctuary of worship. Thank you for your rigorous attention throughout this seminar.